All right. Well, welcome to the live training. I'm really excited to go over this. Obviously behind the scenes, Shawn and I do a lot of talking, and he's always showing me what he's working on. And as we started preparing for this training we're doing today, I just got really excited because I've gotten to put some of this into practice in my own work. But to see the full evolution of what he's come up with, you're really in for a treat today. So today we're going to be talking about the Masterwork Spec Sheet. And this is everything that you need to create a masterwork. And he's going to go through all the different levels, and he's going to do it in a really fun way that I think will really help you understand it. And so just before we really jump in, just to let you know what we're going to be doing here for the next few minutes, about 90 minutes or so, is I'm going to give you a quick introduction, just about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll jump right into the training and let Shawn teach about the Masterwork Spec Sheet. And then after that, I'm going to tell you about the architecture of a masterwork, which is a new seminar series we're doing with Shawn. And I want to introduce you to that and invite you to join that. And then at the end, we'll do a Q&A, and we'll stay on and try to answer as many questions as we possibly can. For those of you that don't know much about me or Shawn or who we are, Shawn is the creator and founder of StoryGrid. I'm going to get more into that in a few minutes, but he's been an editor and writer for over 30 years, and he's worked at major publishing. He started his own publishing houses, and he's worked to help writers create bestsellers for many, many years. Let's see. He's just a student of story. And I'm just, it's such a privilege to learn under him myself, and I'm excited for you as well. My name is Tim Grawl. I'm the CEO of StoryGrid. I started out as the host of the StoryGrid podcast 7 years ago when Shawn and I started the podcast together. And I do all of the operations and marketing behind the scenes here, as well as being Shawn's main student on the podcast as well. And since the beginning, as we've looked at StoryGrid and as we've continued to work on StoryGrid, our goal here, this is what we always come back to, is we want to help you level up your craft as a writer. This is what we always come back to, what we're always thinking about is how do we help writers level up their craft? How do we help writers tell better stories? And we're always trying to just do everything that we can to service that mission and that motto. But of course, when we talk about leveling up your craft, the next question may be, well, what are those levels? What are the levels of writing that we've talked about? Now, I've shared these before in different places, but I always like to just come back to these and look at what we consider the 7 different levels of writing. So this is where you start looking at breaking down a manuscript, a full manuscript, all the way down to the beat by beat level, right? So the beat by beat, line by line writing, they build into tropes, which build into scenes. And then you have a series of scenes that make a sequence. And then you have the 20 skeletal scenes, which we're going to talk a lot about today. Then we have the 4 quadrants of a story. And then, of course, the full manuscript. And to understand writing and to be able to write a story that works, you have to be able to understand and operate at all of these levels of writing. Now, back in 2015 is when Shawn first wrote and published the book, The StoryGrid, What Good Editors Know. And for me, and I'm sure for many of you, this really fundamentally changed your understanding of how story works. And for me, it kind of peeled back this layer of just like cloudiness and fog and started showing me that there was actual fundamental specifications and workings and understandings of how stories actually work. And this is something I'd been looking for years. I'd read all of the books that had come out. I've gone through trainings. I've done all this stuff. And Shawn was really the first one to lay out in specific detail and with specific language how this stuff works. So just a few of the things that he did with his book, The StoryGrid, and what we've gone on to do since is he established a clear and precise definition for genre. He identified the internal and external relationships between the 12 traditional genres, right? So again, I still remember when I read the book and I got to the first section on genre, and I saw how he laid out the 12 genres, and I was like, oh, finally somebody actually explained in concrete terms what the genres are, how many they are, and what separates them. He identified the necessary conventions for each of the genres and the obligatory moments for each of the genres. And he was the first to map the 12 genres onto the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this, again, was a big breakthrough in my understanding. He also mapped the 12 genres onto Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory and mapped them onto the big 5 personality traits. He defined the virtue associations for each of the genre and the value spectrums for each of the genre, and defined the subgenres for each of the genres as well. And this was just some of what he accomplished in the book. And so, again, this was a fundamental shift in my understanding as a storyteller. And what's really cool is that a lot of times, and you've probably seen this out there, a lot of times when somebody lands on something that really works for them, some sort of framework or methodology, they kind of settle in, right? And they start like, this is what I'm going to teach forever. This is what I'm going to do. They travel around to different cities teaching the same thing, or they come out with basically the same course over and over and over, and just mining that and making a good living off of that fundamental understanding. And I, that would make sense. I mean, Shawn spent decades coming up with this stuff. But instead of doing that, Shawn kept studying. He really wanted to build out a full narrative theory and an understanding of what narrative is and how storytelling works from the top to the bottom at all of those different levels. And so if you've been paying attention over the last few years, you've seen that we've continued to do this. So starting in 2017, he did the Love Story Seminar, and this is where he applied the methodology in the book to the most popular genre, the love genre, and looked deeply at Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. And then the next one we hosted was the Big Idea Nonfiction. And this is where Shawn tracked story's origin, identified the 4 nonfiction genres, and building on the Aristotelian thought, introduced the concepts of chaos, order, and complexity into storytelling. And then with Heroic Journey 2.0, he mapped Plato, Aristotle, the alchemists, Freud, Jung, Campbell, Tillich, among other thinkers, to demonstrate the heroic journey's origins and to bring it up into the modern cognitive science-based understanding of what the heroic journey is and how it applies to storytelling in deep detail. And then he hosted the Trinity seminar. This is where he first introduced the Trinity planes of perception of on the surface, above the surface, and beyond the surface, as well as integrating Claude Shannon's information theory into his full narrative theory construction. Now, we've been teaching a lot of these findings on the macro line-by-line level inside of the StoryGrid Guild. But now Shawn is ready to revisit the foundational thinking he had in genre and integrate all of this new understanding at this macro storytelling level. And so going back to these levels of writing, this is what we're going to be looking at today: the 20 skeletal scenes, the quadrants, and the manuscript level. And this is where we're going to look at the Masterwork Spec sheet, and we're going to dive into the Genre Blueprint that Shawn has just recently developed. And so, Shawn, I am ready to turn it over to you.
Okay. Can everybody hear me now? Thumbs up? Yeah. Okay, great. So just having Tim do that review and talking with him over the past 7 years as I've been pursuing my white whale, which is a full narrative theory based upon science and the humanities, philosophy, etc. Tim brilliantly mentioned to me, the thing that was really the turning point for me was my concept of genre, right? So genre is one of those things, it's kind of like an optimal grip on a concept. So one of the things that's difficult and fun and challenging about StoryGrid is the multiple levels of analysis, right? So we can often get, a little bit overwhelmed by all these different ways of looking at story. And so what we discovered, and I think it's true, is that the optimal grip to get into storytelling as a structure in an organization is genre, right? So we all know intuitively what a genre is. We know what one story is different from another just based upon marketing of covers, etc. So this really turned me on to, oh, wow, if I can present what's taken me 7 years and just give sort of the answers to what I've discovered instead of walking people through the explanatory process of how I found it, and if I can make that a genre-based explanation, then I'd really have something. And so I've been working on that over the past, I don't know, 9 months. And what I've come to is what I'm going to be talking about today. So again, the trick here is to make this theory seem kind of like, oh yeah, I always thought that was the case, and that makes sense. So I'm going to walk you through this presentation, and my goal here is to make it as simple as possible so that you can understand exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about masterworks, when I'm talking about genres, the importance of them, etc. So without further ado, and again, I think this is the optimal grip for people to be able to come right into StoryGrid and get the big picture pretty quickly and apply the concepts very quickly and easily too. All right, so this is StoryGrid's Masterwork Spec sheet, and I'm just going to walk everybody through it. Okay. So let's begin by thinking of storytelling in the form of a 3-level house. Okay, so let's move all the theory away for a second and just think of a story as a building. It's a 3-story building, something like this kind of house, right? Okay, so we all know that houses, they afford us a gut attraction or repulsion to their exterior, right? And thereby we have an interest or disinterest in investigating what's inside based upon how they look on the outside. So this house is much, much different than the previous house. So the gut experience of a house, right? It's coarse, it's superficial, it's shiny, and it establishes kind of like a baseline of excitement or intrigue for us as prospective explorers, right? So all of those like Trulia and Home Watch, all that, they call it like real estate porn. It's kind of like moving and showing all these different kinds of structures so that they can excite us and intrigue us so that maybe we'll consider buying them before we even leave our chair. So when you take this concept, just apply it to what's your gut feeling about this house? Like, so what story would the avatars who live in this house tell, right? You kind of think about it. Yeah, I don't know. And what about these avatars? Is there a difference? Well, I think you would all agree. Whoop. I went a little too far here. All right, so let me go here. Okay, so this is what I call coarse, like coarse-grained curb appeal for a particular house, right? So this house up here, I would say this is a house or a story would seem to be kind of about an upper middle class family, like navigating a rather Edenic environment. Look how beautiful it is there. It's a privileged world where people are pressured to conform to the expectations of the collective cultural grammar. So if you live here, you've probably, been able to manage the culture pretty well. You're able to live in there and it's a nice place. Now this house or this story, it would kind of seem to be about some down and outers, with little connection to the collective cultural grammar. They're kind of rejected and alienated people just trying to survive. So all we have are these 2 pictures of a house, and we're already sort of getting a gut reaction to what they might be all about, right? All right, so similarly, a story picture can attract or repulse us with its curb appeal. So this is the original cover, and actually Tolkien created this himself. And you know, what's really interesting about this cover, you'll see you have to open the entire book. So it extends from the front cover all the way to the back with the spine as part of the artwork too, right? And so just looking at this, wow, what does it tell us? It tells us a lot of information. It's very attractive. It's symmetric, right? We see the symmetries at play here. The mountains are symmetric, the trees, it's very beautiful. There's a pathway, there's a mountain at the very top. Here's a dragon. Wow, that's weird. And then you've got these other eagles here. And you've got water, and you've got this little lake, and all kinds of really interesting stuff that's coarsely explaining to us this is a big story. You know, this is going to be a big adventure. All right, so that's kind of the coarse curb appeal of a story. So if we think of a story as if it were a house, let's keep doing that. What would the working blueprints to build it look like? Like, what would the blueprints be? Not just the sketch of what it's going to be, right? That's kind of where we're going with this idea. We're moving towards this. So here's a general blueprint for a house, right? You've got different elevations. You've got floor plans. You've got like where the foundation is. You got all, these are architectural blueprints. And so it's from these blueprints that you actually create buildings. So engineers and contractors follow the blueprints, and they use the measurements in order to create the building. So that's where we're heading here. All right, so what information, let's just pretend for a minute. Let's pretend that we could come up with a blueprint for a story. Not just any story, a masterwork. All right, so what information would the story blueprints tell us? Well, first, the first thing we need is to have a gestalt vision of the kind of house or story we'd like to build, right? We need to have a picture of it in our minds. We need a coarse curb appeal picture in our minds. So this gestalt vision is what we call a global story genre. It's a global story genre. And it's very important because it gives us the coarse curb appeal that's going to signal to a group of interested parties called genre-specific readers that our story is for them. Oh, I like that kind of story. I like the way that looks. Let me open up the book and see what it's about, right? So a global story genre is the big picture. It's the whole of the house. It attracts or repulses readers, just like buildings do, depending upon a particular set of story lovers' dispositions towards its superficial subject matter. All that means is, what's the gut reaction of the people who see the building or see the cover of the story? That's what our global genre does. Let's talk a little bit more about this because this is really important. So choosing the global genre is critical. It's a no turning back decision, right? Why? Because the global genre is the lens through which all other story considerations must be viewed. We have to put on these lenses, these glasses called a global story genre. And when we're looking at putting anything else on the paper, they have to go through this lens. So the global genre gives the author their ultimate concern. It gives them their criterion, right? Their highest reference point from which to evaluate, like, how do you know if it's working? Well, this is the reference point that you use to evaluate how well you are signaling the reoccurring patterns and forms associated with the genre's particular problem space and time signature. That's a very abstract statement, but all stories have particular problem spaces that they're dealing with, and they operate in time, and they have different time signatures. I'm going to get into more detail about what I mean by that in a minute, but just remember there's space and time. So you know how Einstein talked about the space and time as primary forces of how we see the world, the relativity? This is how a story has to embed space and time dimensionality in the story. That's technical, but it's true. Okay. Okay, but here's the problem. Simply hammering away at satisfying only the feature list for the global genre is not enough to satisfy an audience. It's not enough. See, if there's nothing behind the building facade and what one expects is exactly what one gets, the story building isn't going to catch on fire. It will burn out quickly, be unexciting, and unintriguing with no revelatory catharsis to be had for your audience. So it's the equivalent of this constantly burning house on Universal Studios lot. You go on it, you see it, you go, oh, wow, look, it's a house on fire. And then you move on, right? Because behind it, this house never burns down. It's just, sitting there burning. It's not interesting. What? There's nothing behind it. All right, so how the hell do we put anything behind it? Well, let's keep going. All right, so the global genre cannot by itself hold Sam's interest. Now, Sam is a language we use at StoryGrid, and it stands for a single audience member. And I highly recommend when you're writing to think about a single person that you're signaling and sending information to instead of a generic big audience, okay? So we use the word Sam to get everybody to remember. You really should be thinking about talking to one person. All right. So while the global genre signals the whole flavor of the story, it cannot be executed without aspectual contributions from 5 supporting core genres. All that means is we need more juice, right? We need more flavorings to give the story more depth and more interest. All right, so an epic fantasy action story, right? That's what The Hobbit is, in which the fate of a virtual world hangs in the balance. That's absolutely true. It requires clearly qualified and quantified attention to 5 other genres. And those genres are the status genre, morality, and here's another innovation that I discovered in the last 7 years. The heroic journey is embedded in morality. The morality genre is all about the heroic journey. And the heroic journey in my HJ 2.0 version, not Joseph Campbell's. I've got nothing against Joseph Campbell, but he misconstrued, in my estimation, the heroic journey as a result instead of a process. So I reconfigured the heroic journey. That's why I don't call it the hero's journey. It's the heroic journey, and it's 2.0 because it's processional. There's no end product other than development. All right, I don't want to get too much into that, but morality is HJ 2.0. Okay, then we have worldview, love, and horror. So action may be the global genre. It's the global story, right? So that's what Tolkien picked. But he used the other 5 to flavor that action genre to give it more depth and more epic nature to it. All right, so we need these 5 other core genre considerations to direct the nature of the action so that the story expands beyond life and death value shifts. That's what action is, right? Life and death. So if every single scene turned just on life and death, it would become monotonous and too over the top to simulate reality. We would say this doesn't make any sense because this isn't the way my life works. I don't face life and death circumstances every moment of my consciousness during the day. You got to have mix-ups, right? Things are changing. There are different things at stake instead of just life and death. The overarching thing, we all are facing life and death, right? That's our global massive arc, but we don't do it every day. Okay. So just to reiterate here, superficial attraction to the global genre is necessary to attract an audience. It's absolute. You need the coarse curb appeal, but it's not sufficient to capture an audience in and through time. It's not sufficient. You can't just deal with the global genre. All right, so all right, let's talk about how do we define masterworks? Well, masterworks like The Hobbit or Pride and Prejudice or Jane Eyre or what have you, they capture audiences in and through time. So The Hobbit was a very popular book within Tolkien's lifetime. After he died, it got even more popular. That's what we're talking about. How did he pull off that trick? He created a work of art that outlasted his days on the planet. That's what a masterwork does. And we at StoryGrid, we say that's something to hold up as an aspirational thing to do. So, all of us aren't ever going to write masterworks, but isn't it a good aspiration to try, to increase the probability at the very least? So let's look at the stories that really work and take a really good hard look at them so that we can enable our problem solving when we're trying to tell our story. That's what we do at StoryGrid. That's what masterworks are all about. Okay. Well, no, all right, so I just established a lot of problems, right? Well, how do we put these 5 other genres on the global and how do you do this? So what are the necessary and sufficient features for the construction of a masterwork? How do you construct one? Let's go back to the house analogy, okay? All right, what else would we need to build a house besides the target vision, right? The curb appeal of the final product, that nice sketch that your architect shows you. This is what your house is going to look like. And you're like, great. That's not enough to build the house. The architect has to then go back and do the blueprints, right? So what would they do to do that? Well, they need to wire the house, right? With power, plumbing, and ventilation. We need that stuff in the house, right? We need to compartmentalize rooms according to their purpose, right? We need kitchen, dining room, bathrooms, bedrooms, reading rooms, libraries, offices, etc. Okay, that's 2. 3, we need to decorate the rooms according to the prospective tenant's wants, needs, and desires. I need light in the afternoon, so I need blah, right? So you need to talk to the prospective tenants. And then lastly, or simultaneously, this is important, we need to consider the social laws, norms, and codes of the culture such that the house will fit into its culture, right? While also securing its inhabitants' safety and privacy from that culture. So it needs to be self-contained, but live inside the culture, right? So you don't want to build a McMansion right next to a series of row houses. Why? Because you're not going to fit into the neighborhood. Everyone's going to say, what's with the jerk with the McMansion? We all have modest middle-level houses here. Why is this person showing off? It's not fitting into the neighborhood. All right, cool. So this is what the things you have to think about when you're creating a building. All right, so StoryGrid's Masterwork Spec Sheet is the blueprint to embed these essential features in a story. So what I'm now doing is I'm taking those essential features for how to build a building, and I'm showing you how we manage that at StoryGrid to build story buildings. Okay, so we need the wire, the house with power, plumbing, and ventilation. I've got 3 planes of perception that I built out in the Trinity seminar. And they're called on the surface, above the surface, and beyond the surface. These are planes of perception that we all have. I got it from cognitive science and information theory and thermodynamics and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I'm not going to talk about that. I promise. I always end up talking about it, but I'll put a pin in it as best as I can. But all these things mean these are these 3 channels by which we navigate the world. All right, and they're indispensable to us. And they're indispensable to a story. Why? Because a story is a simulation of life. So if we want to simulate life, we better know how life works. And life works with these 3 channels. Okay, and what they also enable is the reader to hear, feel, and see the story in their minds. So each of these has hearing, feeling, and seeing associated with them, which is going to be really helpful for us when we get a little bit confused. All right. We need to metaphorically compartmentalize rooms according to their purpose. That's what the 20 skeletal scene list is going to do for us. It attends to this feature, right? We need to decorate the rooms. So we're going to use 3 genres to decorate the rooms to express the wants, needs, and desires of our avatars. And those 3 genres are status, morality, and worldview. All right, so what about the simulation of the virtual world bound by social laws, norms, and codes? Well, we need these to be in flux, right? We need them to be like, we're not really sure where this is going. This culture's in trouble. What are these avatars going to do about it? Okay, and we have 3 genres that enable us to generate that kind of conflict, and those are action, love, and horror. They attend to these features. Okay, cool. In other words, we need governing genres and generating genres. And you know what a governor function and a generator function does when they are in sync? They create an engine. An engine. So when you have a constraint that governs a piston in a cylinder, and you fire heat underneath the cylinder piston such that it goes up, it's constrained, and then it can turn the drive shaft of your car. That's how engines work. So you need governing constraints and generating constraints to create a virtual engine. That's what a story is. It's a virtual engine. So governing constraints that define the structural boundary conditions of the house or the story, the shared space that binds the beings inside that building or that story to one another. We need clearly defined context. So the governing genres give us clearly defined spatial context. Remember I was talking about space and time? This is how we handle the space dimension. It's through the governing genres that enable this function. Okay. What about the generating genres? Well, these deal with time. These deal with the organization within those structures that entangle, grow, build up, and break down avatars in time. So we need to clearly define avatar interaction that defines how individual, collective, and universal goal states in the story's virtual world are achieved or not. Generating genres enabled this function. Okay, cool. All right, so we got our 2 kinds of things. We need governors and generators to have a virtual engine. All right, let's take the governing genre structural constraints for a minute. Let's take a look at those and walk through them so you know exactly what I'm talking about. All right, so the governing structural constraints of a story are 3 genres, and these live in socially constructed problem spaces. They concern the relationship between an individual avatar and the social world they inhabit. In other words, the virtual world. How does existence work in this virtual world? That's what these genres signal to Sam. All right, so what are the existential concerns? We need to think about the existential concerns. Well, what are they? Well, how am I seen? How am I seen in the world, right? So where does one reside on the virtual world success, failure, status hierarchy, right? What is the avatar's identity? How are they seen by the other creatures in that virtual world? That's the status genre. Okay, what's next? Well, what is the individual avatar known as? What is their morality? Who is considered courageous? Who is charismatic? Who is transparent and ethereal? Who is heroic and anti-heroic? That's how a being is known in the virtual world and in the real world, by the way. Lastly, what does the individual avatar's worldview value above all other concerns? How are they valued in the society? Are they creators who serve something, or are they destroyers who serve nothing? That's the worldview concept. All right, so that's the governing structural constraints. Now, these live on a stack. So now we're going to combine our 3 planes of perception, and we're going to associate them with these governing genres, right? So on the surface, governing constraints concern an individual avatar's status in the virtual world. What's their identity? Who are they? Above the surface, governing constraints concern an individual avatar's morality. How do they process in the virtual world? How do they navigate it? Are they heroic? Are they charismatic? How are they doing it? How are they processing the world, and how is the world processing them? Beyond the surface, governing constraints concern an individual avatar's ultimate concern, the content of their character. This is defined as their worldview. What do they believe in beyond all other concepts? What is their virtue? How virtuous are they? Okay, now what about the generating organizational constraints? Now, these are the behaviors of the individual avatars in clearly defined time. These are time. So the virtuosity of the avatars must be generated by how they act, how they come into relationship, and how they solve problems. So what action does the avatar physically generate? That's the action genre. What do they actualize physically? What do they do? That's really important, right? We've got to see their behavior on the page, right? The second one, how does the avatar build up and break down relationships? How do they generate love? That's what love is. You build up and you break down relationships in your life. That's the love function. And the more relationships that are strong for you, the better your mental health is. But you got to break down some ones too, right? So building up and breaking down relationships is the world of love. How do you process people and connection? Lastly, how does the avatar solve problems? Do they engage in curiosity and wonder when confronted with ill-defined problems? Or do they disengage in horror and awe when their cognitive skills prove inadequate? Horror is all about problem solving. And if you can't solve a problem, do you run away from it, screaming in terror? Or do you poke at it, sit with it, live? These are what the avatars do on the page. Okay, those are the generating organizational constraints. So these live on a temporal stack, meaning time. So on the surface, generating constraints concern an individual avatar's action in the now of the virtual world, right now. What's going on now? Above the surface are all about the duration of the virtual world. How are they managing their relationships in the duration of the span of the story? How are their relationships building up, breaking down, building up, breaking down? Are they getting stronger? Or are they getting weaker? What's going on with their relationships? That's durational. So you might be in great relationship with somebody right now, but it shifts, right? You might get in a fight with them tomorrow. Will that break the relationship forever, or will you get over it? That's how you manage relationships in duration of time. Okay, lastly, beyond the surface, generated constraints concern an individual's avatar's cognitive capacity to cope with the horror of fateful uncertainty. All that means is that we cannot explain the causal factors for a lot of the things that happen in our lives. How we deal with that is how we deal with horror. So for example, if a friend of yours is happy and jolly and having a great time, and you're going to meet them for coffee, and they step off the corner and they get hit by a truck accidentally, that's fate. It's coincidence, it's random, it's horrifying. They didn't do anything wrong, and yet they died. That's fate, and it's horrifying because we can't do, there's all stoicism was built on trying to come out. All religion is to deal with fateful uncertainty. This is beyond the surface. This is stuff we cannot control. How do you deal with it? Is it horrifying, or can you flow with it? All right. Wow, that's a lot of stuff, right? How are we going to track all that? It seems crazy. So can we construct a tool that enables us to track all of these features on a single hypergrid? I think you know the answer. All right, so this is a typical blueprint for a construction of a house, right? All right, so this is the StoryGrid blueprint for the construction of a masterwork. Don't worry, I'm going to break it down for you. But this is an entire novel on a single grid that you can use as reference points when you are working through your own stuff. Because the master writers had to solve the same problems that you're trying to solve. So isn't it a good idea to consult and take a look at how they solve the problem you're facing so that maybe it can inspire you and give you some insights on how to fix it? I think so. All right, so let me break it down for you. It's very, very simple. The technology is extraordinarily simple and remarkably powerful. It's not confusing. This is not a scary spreadsheet. I swear to God, it is not. You don't have to worry about spreadsheets. It's on a spreadsheet, but it's simple. Okay, so let me walk you through it. There are 20 columns, right? There are 20 columns that represent the 4 quadrants of a story. So if you're not familiar with the 4 quadrants, that's okay. You're going to learn them. This is very much a StoryGrid technology concept, but I'll certainly walk through them in great detail. All right, so the 4 quadrants are, this is the beginning hook. This is middle build up. This is the middle breakdown. And this is the ending payoff. These are the 4 quadrants of a story. Beginning hook, build up, breakdown, payoff. Hook, build, oop. Okay, so that's what these columns are in the 4. The other columns here that are broken into 5 in each of the 4, these are the 5 commandments of the obligatory moments for each quadrant. So each quadrant has an inciting incident, a turning point progressive complication, a crisis, a climax, and a resolution. So all 5 are represented in each of these quadrants. All right, cool. So what we've got is 20 across, and we've got 15 down. There's 15 rows on this hypergrid. And there's 300 data boxes inside, 300, that are going to explain in the greatest detail and highest resolution that you can imagine about how Tolkien solved all these problems. Tolkien had to put 5 commandments in all of his quadrants, and he did it brilliantly. All right, I'm not going to walk through these one by one. I'm going to just leave this on the screen for a minute, and then if you watch the video back, you can read this. And also, this is going to be on the website. So here's a description of the 15 rows, and then I'm going to show you a visual representation. All right, so that's the first 7. And here are the other 8. And they're all very consistent, right? So we're going to be breaking down the genres using the same concepts. All right, so I'm going to move now into the rows. All right, so here's the top of the spreadsheet. Okay, so what we have here on the left, it says invariant structural constraints. Pardon me. The invariant structural constraints are all those things that we talk about: inciting incident, turning point, crisis, climax, resolution. And at StoryGrid, we have very, very coarse-grained, generalized principles that explain all of these. So I'm going to go through them one by one with the generalized explanation. And then underneath, down here, I'm going to explain how the final synthesis of each of those is represented in The Hobbit. And so, wow, that's cool, but how do you get to the synthesis, right? So generally up here is what we call the foolscap one-page story grid. So it gives you the final resolution of a story, but it doesn't give you the dimensionality underneath it. So this is a higher resolution examination of the foolscap page that gives you a lot more information. All right, cool. So at the top are our governing genres, right? So what's this? This is status, and it concerns on the surface. So status is a green zone genre. Okay, what's this? Morality. This is another governing zone. This is above the surface. And then we've got worldview, which is blue. Now, each of these, I'm going to walk through all of these details about what the hell these genres are about. Okay, so we're going to get the governing genre description, core virtue association, core value association, core dispositional trait association, core determinative analytical sense, right? And then the core qualification. What is this telling Sam? All of this stuff is about how do we get all of this information to Sam? Okay, cool. And then I'll run it through, going through the entire status genre itself with the generalized principles up here. So all status stories are going to have these generalized features, and then these are the specifics beneath that from the Hobbit. And this little dashes in between are going to tell you what scene in The Hobbit that particular thing is met. So you can go back to the book, read the scene, you'll be like, oh, I don't remember that. Well, you'll get a scene number that will tell you which scene in The Hobbit that particular five commandment was abided by. Same thing with morality and worldview. Okay, the bottom are the generator genres, right? So these are variants of green, red, and blue. So we got light green, pink, and light blue. And those are action, love, and horror. And so I'll be walking through all 20 of the generalized principles for each of those genres too. So at the end of this crazy course, you're going to have this. And this will have 300 data points of every single genre that I described. You're going to see how these 6 in each column come together for the synthesis in the gray. So that's the blueprint. And also, this blueprint can be adapted for any masterwork. You can take Silence of the Lambs, put this there. You can take anything. You can take Moby Dick. You name it. Cool. All right. So what are you going to have at the end of this thing? I have to move my thing here. All right. So the StoryGrid blueprint schema, that's kind of what I'm calling this. It's a blueprint schema. It's not a feature list. It's showing how all the features interact, right? It's not just a checklist. It's showing how all they work together to synthesize into a final scene, a scene synthesis that we call scene synthesis. All right, so this provides a 3-dimensional understanding of genre at a level that's never been revealed before. This is brand new technology. It's sort of like a brand new theory. I don't want to conflate myself, but it is sort of like, oh, I've got this idea about relativity. So this is sort of like that. This is a brand new paradigm based upon a lot of hard work, which I'm not afraid to talk about. All right, so the story grid blueprint schema provides a three-dimensional understanding of genre and all of the must-have features that are shared by all masterworks. Every masterwork has 20 skeletal scenes, 4 quadrants, and they all operate on 6 core genres. All right. It is purely descriptive and methodologically reproducible for any masterwork analysis. That's a big, big claim, but it's very, very true. This will become the core part of the core curriculum for future teachings that we give at Sorgrid. It's that powerful. It's an indispensable tool to focus a writer's planning and execution of their story. When a writer or editor knows how artists of the past solved the very same problems that the writer is confronting in real time, the solutions to the problems become more probable. Why? Because you can feel like, oh, I'm not alone here. Tolkien faced this problem. How did he solve it? Jane Austen faced this problem. How did she solve it? What about Chekhov, right? What about Harlan Coben? What about, name your writer. All right, so there's going to be a full set of macro storytelling resources, and they're integrated throughout the lectures. So there won't be a lot of lecturing about these things. You'll see them in action. So you're going to get genre cheat sheets in each of these things that for action, love, horror, status, morality, and worldview. You're going to get a very clear understanding about what the Trinity planes of perception are all about and how they map onto these 6 core genres. And then you're going to get 20 skeletal scenes for each of the 6 core genres, both generalized and specific. So that adds up to 300 data points. And at the very end of the class, I'm going to map the rest of the genres that aren't on this schema and show you where they sit. So things like performance, crime, thriller, society, those all fit in this schema. And in fact, I've discovered quite a number more that haven't even been named yet. So I'm going to name them. But a lot of them are, they make a lot of sense when you go through the structures by which I came up with this stuff. All right, so enough of that. Let's go back to the 2 houses, right? Let's go back to these 2 houses. And let's think about these 2 houses again. What would you expect the avatars who live in this house, what would they be like in there? What about the avatars that live in this house? Let's think about that. All right, well, here's the truth. This house here is where J.R.R. Tolkien lived when he wrote The Hobbit, right? Now, Tolkien's personal history is made up of really modest beginnings. Intellectual strivings. He became a professor at Oxford, very young, worked his ass off, linguistics expert. And he had a transformational trauma induced by the Great War. So this isn't the home of a upper middle class guy. This is the home of a guy who wrote The Hobbit, who suffered a lot of trauma and had very, very modest beginnings. So this house isn't what it looks like. What about this house? Well, this is the Grey Gardens house. And if you've never seen the documentary, I highly recommend it. But these are about these 2 ladies, the Beals, and their personal history is one that was made up of privileged beginnings, intellectual deprivation. They weren't allowed to learn. They were just supposed to be, fanciful ladies. It's a different era. And transformational trauma induced by flights of fancy. They were lied to, and they lived like that. So we would expect this to be down and outers, but they're not. And that's how stories work. The coarse grain outside the building is not enough. You have to surprise your readers by embedding information like this in the trajectory of the story. And the story grid, schema the hyper genre blueprint is the means by which you can accomplish that. So, oh, that's pretty good. It was about an hour. So that's where I'm going to stop, and I'm going to turn it over to Tim. But I hope you're as excited about this as I am. This is like when I came up with the 5-leaf genre clover, I thought, oh, this is amazing. This is a whole new level of genre understanding. And I'm really excited to roll it out. And I think it's going to give everyone the optimal grip to be able to come to terms with our other levels of analysis at StoryGrid. And it's going to fit into our global framework, because we do have a very, very organized and ordered global framework of our narrative theory. And this is a great way to bring people into all the investigations and all the discoveries that I've made over the last 7 years.
Well, thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.